When people think of Tolkien's work, they don't think of the horror genre. And this is a fair enough assessment. None of Tolkien's work is horror in the same way that someone like Stephen King writes horror. But horror does exist in Tolkien's work. It's subtle, and much of it is left to the reader's imagination. But when you cut through all the vagaries and truly comprehend what Tolkien might have had in mind, then you can appreciate just how good, or rather, how horrific, some of it truly is. Today I want to talk about the Dead Men of Dunharrow. You might know them as the Oathbreakers or the Army of the Dead, although that last term only appears in the movies. If you've only seen the movies, you'll remember them as the spooky green ghosts that murder Sauron's army at the Pelennor Fields, a controversial change to say the least. If you've read the books, you'll know their role is a bit more subdued. Aragorn uses them to capture the Corsair fleet at Peligir, and it's unsure whether the ghosts could actually physically harm a person, as fear was the only weapon they needed. Whether you've read the books or only seen the movies, you might come to the same conclusion. The Dead Men of Dunharrow aren't overly scary, at least not in the same way that true horror stories are. The scenes in Return of the King were less tense, largely owing to Aragorn's larger-than-life presence and Gimli's comedy relief. As for the books, the passage is quite short, and much of the backstory of the Paths of the Dead is given in the following chapter, at which point Aragorn and the Grey Company have already successfully passed through. But the real horror doesn't come from the events in The Lord of the Rings. No, that's the conclusion of the story of the Dead Men of Dunharrow. The real horror is in the mystery that shrouds them, and how they came to become the ghosts that the people of Rohan and Gondor feared. We know very little about the Dead Men of Dunharrow, even while they were alive. They were known as the Men of the Mountains, apparently living in the western end of the White Mountains. They are considered by many to be pre-Númenóreans, and were likely related to the Dunlendings and the other native men of Gondor and Calenadon. We know very little about their society. How advanced were they? What was their culture and customs? What was their relation like with other peoples? What we do know is that during the Dark Years, the years between the forging of the One Ring and the founding of Gondor and Arnor, these men apparently worshipped Sauron. We're unsure whether they willingly adopted this, or whether this was forced upon them, but by the time of Gondor's founding, these men already had a dark reputation. Dark reputation or not, during the Dark Years these men seem to have become powerful, and after the founding of Gondor, Isildur, co-king with his brother Anarion, gained the allegiance of the Men of the Mountains. They swore to him that they would fight Sauron if he returned, and in their words, even though death should take us. But when Sauron did return, the Men of the Mountains went back on their word. As I said earlier, they had worshipped Sauron during the Dark Years, and would not fight against their former master. Instead, they likely would have fought against Gondor if not for Isildur's words. Thou shalt be the last king, and if the West prove mightier than thy black master, this curse I lay upon thee and thy folk, to rest never until your oath is fulfilled, for this war will last through years uncounted, and you shall be summoned once again ere the end. What one must understand is that oaths seemingly have a lot of power in Tolkien's universe. There is no solid in-universe explanation as to how they work, but they are not to be sworn lightly, and if one does forsake an oath or forego it, there are consequences for oath breaking. My favourite theory is that in the case of the Men of the Mountains, it is likely they swore their oath by Eru Ilúvatar, just as the oath of Eöl was sworn 2,500 years later. Upon breaking their oath, Isildur cursed them, which was effectively an appeal to power for divine punishment. As oaths are sacred in Tolkien's world, Eru Ilúvatar obliged, and the Men of the Mountains were cursed. A similar theory is that by breaking their oath to Isildur, they gave Isildur the power to curse them, which certainly might have been possible, considering the power of his lineage. They feared these words so much that they fled back into the mountains, hiding in their secret places and refusing to deal with other men. They did not go forth to fight for Sauron, and from this point on, they were largely forgotten. Sauron was defeated and Isildur's curse came into effect. This is where the horror begins. How Isildur's curse worked is unknown, but the end result is known. The Men of the Mountains were denied the gift of men. Their souls could not travel through the halls of Mandos and out of Arda like that of other men, and instead their spirits lingered, becoming ghosts trapped to eternal undeath, haunting their old places in the mountains. This isn't overly horrific. Souls being forced to linger around in undeath is a common trope in fantasy. Except in this case, this was an entire people, and even more horrifying, this did not happen to them right away. As said by Aragorn, the Men of the Mountains slowly dwindle away in their barren hills, yet there is mention of them existing for some time to come. In the unfinished tales, King Amroth of Lorien and his beloved Nimrodel are attempting to sail into the west. Somehow they become split up in the White Mountains, and Amroth arrives in Edelond alone. There, the remaining elves inform him that the men of Gondor are good and would help Nimrodel if they found her, but in the mountains are many unfriendly men and evil things. The unfriendly men almost certainly refers to the men of the mountains, and evil things may possibly refer to the ghosts of these men that now haunt the mountains. This means that 2,000 years later, the men of the mountains are still around, although a dying and dwindling people. Things take a much darker turn after that. Following the founding of Rohan, the second king, Brago, and his eldest son, Baldur, happen upon the dark door in the dim hole that leads to the paths of the dead. On the threshold sat an old man, aged beyond guess of years. Tall and kingly he had been, but now he was withered as an old stone. Indeed, for stone they took him, for he moved not, and he said no word, until they sought to pass him by and enter. And then a voice came out of him, as if it were out of the ground, and to their amazement it spoke in the Western tongue. "The way is shut." Then they halted and looked at him, and saw that he lived still, but he did not look at them. "The way is shut," his voice said again. "It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it, until the time comes. The way is shut." "And when will that time be?" said Baldur, but no answer did he ever get, for the old man died in that hour and fell upon his face, and no other tidings of the ancient dwellers in the mountains have our folk ever learned. Who was this man? What was his purpose? Just another mystery in Tolkien's universe. I had theories of my own. This man was maybe the last of the men of the mountains, the last man doomed to die yet not find peace. And perhaps being the last of his people, he decided to wait outside the dark door, to warn anyone that might come across it. Referring to the line, "tall and kingly he had been," I thought of an event further fetched. Perhaps this man was the last king of the mountains, doomed to live an unnaturally long life until the last of his people had gone. In that case, he would be the last king of the mountains, yet he would still not outlast his people. I will admit that my theory is not bulletproof, however. There is a passage that might contradict it, written by Tolkien but never published in any of his works. Although never published, it still must be considered to be word of God. The men of darkness built temples, some of great size, usually surrounded by dark trees, often in caverns, natural or delved, in secret valleys of mountain regions, such as the dreadful halls and passages under the haunted mountain beyond the dark door, the Gate of the Dead, in Dunharrow. The special horror of the closed door before which the skeleton of Baldur was found was probably due to the fact that the door was the entrance to an evil temple hall to which Baldur had come, probably without opposition up to that point, but the door was shut in his face, and enemies that had followed came up and broke his legs and left him to die in the darkness, unable to find any way out. Mentioned earlier, Baldur is an idiot, and a Prince of Rohan that attempted to walk the paths of the dead. Aragorn finds his corpse when he treads the paths of the dead 500 years later. One must ask the question, who were the enemies that had followed him and broken his legs? Were the ghosts capable of physical violence? Or were there still some people left, even after the death of the old man outside the door? Were they the last pitiful survivors of the ancient people, stalking the halls of their homes like savages until death finally took them? Did they live in that evil temple hidden behind the closed door? When they died off may change, but when Aragorn arrived during the War of the Ring, one thing is certain. They were all dead. Every single person of that ancient people had died, and as far as we know, they had all become ghosts, the Dead Men of Dunharrow. You think about what this may have been like, and you may begin to understand the horror of it. When those ancient men of the mountains fled from Isildur, I wonder if they understood the magnitude of their mistake. I wonder what it began to look like. Their people slowly dwindled, but from what? Did their society break down into generations-long civil war that eventually wiped them out? Were they stricken by diseases? Perhaps their birth rate plummeted, maybe they struggled to have children, or maybe many of the children they did have were stillborn. Perhaps their crops did not grow, perhaps their hunters returned without capture. I wonder when the ghosts appeared. Did they appear right after one's death? Were they haunting their old temples and settlements even as the living attempted to go on with their day-to-day lives? What effect would that have on the society? We know the terrible aura of fear that the Dead Men of Dunharrow gave off, so terrible that only the strongest of men could resist fleeing from their very presence. Did they have that same terrifying effect on their own people? How could people even attempt to live normally knowing that their eventual fate was to be trapped into seemingly eternal undeath? That poses some other questions too. If this continued for generations, and I say if, because I will pose another explanation at the end, but if this continued for generations, then did people try to somehow escape the curse? Did they try to flee? Or was the curse so heavy on their being that they could not leave even if they wanted to? Did they attempt to beg Eru Iluvatar for forgiveness, or did they double down on their worship of Sauron? If they did, I wonder what went on in that temple that Tolkien spoke about. Did they try human sacrifice? We know that Sauron was into that sort of thing. I wonder what depravities occurred in a society where the people were doomed to undeath and extinction. Whatever you believe the answer to these to be, I think we can all agree on one thing. It would have been terrifying. Especially for those last men, perhaps the ones that killed Baldur, or maybe the man who died outside of the Dark Door. They would have been born into a failing people, and despite all their efforts or merits, there was not a thing that they could do to change their fate. Not until the heir of Isildur arrived in the hour of need. Ironically, depending on your point of view, perhaps it's the men who originally betrayed Isildur who suffered the least, and perhaps their society still prospered for a little while in their days. Or maybe they suffered the most, forced into undeath for thousands of years. There is a version of events that I feel might be a little less awful, but perhaps not as believable. That's that the Dead Men of Dunharrow were in fact wraiths similar to the Nazgul, and that they did not actually die, and instead faded. This means that maybe unborn generations did not suffer the same fate, and that the Oathbreakers that Aragorn summoned were simply the original people. I find this unbelievable for two reasons. We know the Men of the Mountains persisted for at least 2,000 years after the curse. I find it hard to believe that it would take that long for normal mortal men to fade. Secondly, Brago and Baldur witnessed the old man outside the Dark Door physically die, rather than fade away. Unfortunately, I think the first theory is far more likely. So here ends our discussion on the Dead Men of Dunharrow. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I hope you learned something new today, and I want people to comment, discussing their own theories, or perhaps the answers to the questions I posed. After all, this is all mystery, never to be explained, so unless you say something really stupid, no one can prove you wrong. Thank you, again, farewell, and remember, you can't oath break if you're a bitch who never makes oaths.